Copyright notice. You are free to download and copy this work in audio format for replay in any audio or video mode, and I encourage you to do so and enjoy and learn. You may redistribute it in a non-commercial fashion, that is, not for profit directly or indirectly. You may not sell or seek to profit from this publication in part or in whole, nor may you translate it into any written format for any purpose. Thank you. Chapter 16 of the E-Novel survival novel, When the Walls Came Tumbling Down, as read by the author. The Nomads. Sitting in his office, watching the sun slowly inch its way across the floor toward his desk, the ox had time to think carefully about his situation as he leaned back in the chair. The leather commander's chair, with its diamond tuck, hand-finished look, reminded the ox of why he hated officers, especially commanders, so much. Who did they think they were to have more money spent on their chairs and office furniture than some of their soldiers made in a whole year? His mind drifted to the problem at hand. Just a few months ago, Ox mused that he would have thought that things were fine, that they were in hog heaven. Now, though, the burden of command, of having to think far ahead, became more than he wanted to deal with. Why couldn't he just go back to the way he had it at Fort Drum? Why had he pushed it? If he had behaved, had not gotten greedy, he could have had a good life. It wouldn't be much, but it would be something. His mind went to the problems at hand, to leaving, to moving on. The fuel would not last indefinitely, and when they left, they would take all they could somehow. The town nearby had been looted of short-term things like food, water, medicine, tools, and clothing, but long-term things like barrels and extra gas tanks on vehicles were quite abundant. That looting and the idiots who were burning people out were part of the reason they had to leave. Too many people competing for the same limited resources. The only people who might have had a chance of kickstarting things were being killed or burned out. It seemed like the good people, the workers and builders, were being killed off by the unprepared but desperate looters and robbers and murderers. Now they would leave, go north, to Canada, where their firepower would be even more lethal against a poorly armed and even disarmed farm populace who were armed at best with some hunting rifles. Too easy for a man with a semi-auto to take down many times his number of men armed with bolt-action jobs, especially if that man had solid training in the use of his weapons, was working in conjunction with a team of men trained the same way. Water and food they could most likely get along the way, but they were short of personnel, and it was wearing them down. Already the grind of guard duty and patrol was taking its toll. Ox put two and two together and decided to recruit more foot soldiers. Ox was not surprised at how many people were willing to volunteer to do something for food and security, rather at how many were willing to set aside scruples and former principles. He would take the approved candidates to his office and lay the cards on the table and say, "Look, we do raids to acquire provisions, to get what we need. Nobody's going to take care of us, so we have to take care of ourselves. Sometimes people get greedy. They want to fight with us, and when we do fight, and if they don't comply, we shoot them. Do you have a problem with that?" So far, not one person had said they did, and only a couple seemed to hesitate. It was amazing how quickly principle and higher ideals went out the window for most people when they were desperate. At first, the plan was to simply pick up another 12 people. They quickly got that many in the first day. Ox realized that they could get a lot more, but how would he move these people? Shamron had told him of a school nearby that had buses, the kind that ran on diesel. A quick trip there, and they netted 4 of them, which actually had some fuel still in them. While the school cafeteria had been looted of food, the fuel tanks on the other buses drained dry, many of the buses were still functional. Shamron had told them of a government warehouse that had been used to stockpile FEMA supplies nearby. He said that he had been there only once to do some kind of work. It wasn't a distribution point, just a warehouse that used to be a meatpacking plant. The place had a very high security door to it. no windows, and was so remote, so nondescript, that the ox would not have even bothered with it, and inside was a jackpot. The warehouse was not fully stocked. Apparently someone had taken a huge amount of goods out. Ox wondered why the workers had not returned, and surmised that they might have been taking supplies into the eye of the storm, so to speak, and been wiped out by the panicked hordes of people. Still, there was a lot left. Stacks of MREs and canned goods, blankets, toilet paper, diapers, water, some minor medical supplies like bandages. In one corner were boxes of body bags, clothes, and more. Everything for an emergency, but no fuel and, of course, no ammo. No matter, though. They would take what they needed. Shamron was put in charge and said there was enough in the warehouse to fill several large semi-trucks. They had no trucks, but knew where to get more buses. They picked up an additional 5 buses and stripped out the seats. With all the extra helpers now, that had been no problem. They shuttled several loads back to the armory, and Ox allowed everyone to pick through what else they needed. This was a gold mine. The armory had dozens of gallons of paint, olive drab, 1 each, in 1-gallon buckets, and the first job for the recruits was to paint buses. After this came some weapons training, but without ammo, that was too precious to waste. They would get their first training in combat with live ammunition if they needed it. Ox's army, as he called it, was very short of ammo, of course, but now they had need as well for those additional weapons that were in the arms vault. The vault had not been broken into, although someone had certainly tried, and succeeded only in smashing off the tumbler face and nothing else. Idiots. It took several days of work with sledgehammers to knock a hole in the reinforced concrete sidewall, a task that Ox handed to the growing number of workers in their midst. After the wall was stripped back big enough, a cutting torch blew through the 1/2-inch steel plate on the inside wall. A hole big enough for a small person to fit, and Ox had sent one of the smaller women in. They had no bolt cutters. Someone had stolen those, and so she had to use the cutting torch to burn off padlocks, because the weapons were also locked into racks and cages as well. Good Lord, he thought, talk about overkill. The girl had to come back out of the arms vault, though, because the fumes and smoke got too bad. They sent her in the following morning, and she had passed out all the arms there, over 200 M16A2 rifles, 40 M4 carbines, 36 M9 pistols, a dozen 240 Bravo machine guns, and 24 M249 squad automatic weapons, as well as 250 bayonets. There was no weapons lube. That had been stored in the motor pool cage and had already been stolen. There was no pistol ammo, but Ox had issued these to all of his initial people, his Praetorian Guard, as he thought of them. The new recruits got the rifles and carbines, and everyone got a bayonet. Ox thought this later would be good if they ran out of ammo, and might also help them as a sort of compliance device. Ammo was tight, and they would give only 1 magazine per person to the new people. His original dozen, of course, kept their basic ammo load. They were his real fighters. These people were the cannon fodder, though. Speed bumps at best. Mitchell would have to train them, but some had prior military service and might work out. These would be his expendables. He would keep his core people in reserve in any engagement if it were necessary, have them possibly lead the raids to acquire more supplies. Ox knew that the windfall of supplies from the warehouse was temporary, though, and that this area would be teeming with desperate people all too soon. Even if they won every battle, they would slowly run out of ammo. They had to find a permanent locale, but where? Mitchell was in charge of training the fodder and gave some basic marksmanship instruction to them. Some showed talent and promise, others not so much. They would still serve a purpose, though. Many would die, and Ox knew it. He wanted to keep his core. That was what kept him in business, kept him alive. There were a lot of women now, too, and several couples, but Ox had turned away anyone with children. They could barely get by with what they had and could not afford any extra mouths to feed. He didn't want to be a babysitter. He hated children anyway. Ox's men had no women for themselves, and he didn't want drama and fights. He had therefore instructed Mitchell to also pick women, especially pretty ones, and some of them were actually proving to be more effective foot soldiers than the men. Ox smiled at that. What a fantasy! What if he could recruit an army of beautiful Amazon princesses? He noticed himself acting a little more like the old first sergeants he used to hate, too. Now he understood why they had to be such hard-asses. You couldn't let the troops start thinking they belonged to a democracy too much, or they would stop doing anything they didn't want to do. He also understood now all the headaches that those men went through. The logistics alone were killing him. They would have to move. There was no other way around it now. They would head north and provision themselves along the way by raiding and hope it was enough. Fuel would be nearly as crucial as ammo. When they got to farm country, they would figure something else out, but at least food would not be so much a problem in the interim. Right now, they were scavenging and there was little to nothing. He told Mitchell and Shamron to make it happen. They would leave the armory in 3 days. Good men. Hearing the bad news from Steve, I dismounted from the tractor quickly and moved to put on my gear. Take me there, please. I called for Maggie, and together we all ran back down the hill, crossed over the river, and back up to Eddie's house in less than 10 minutes. Bill was there along with a dozen others, and more people were starting to flow in. Bill shook his head, and I went to speak with him. It's bad, Al, Bill began. Sheriff Branstorm says that whoever did it apparently was let in, that Max didn't even know. It had to be someone who knew Eddie. Eddie fed him, too. There were 2 plates at table. Bill paused to let that sink in. The killer took Eddie's gun and some other things. Not sure what exactly he got. Where's the sheriff, Bill? Is he inside? I asked, and I started to go into the house. No, he said that he had to move while the trail was still fresh. I nodded. Who went with him, Bill? Bill stopped and said, Sheriff insisted he go alone on this one. I couldn't believe this. Are you kidding me, Bill? Adolph was a good man, elected unanimously to be our sheriff, but I couldn't believe he would be this foolish. Then, too, I understood. This man who had killed Eddie was a cold-blooded man, and another man might be a liability in the hunt. He said to tell you specifically not to come, Al. I looked at Bill for a second and said, Yeah, Bill, but the sheriff isn't my boss. I'm commander of security, you know. Bill smiled and said, Adolph said you'd say that. He told me to tell you that as commander, your place is here with the town. I shook my head and said, Bill, which way did he go? Because the sheriff is going to need me. He smiled and said, He said you'd say that too, and he told me to promise not to say. Without saying a word and with some sorrow in his eyes, Bill pointed toward the Moose Run Trail. Remember, Al, I didn't say which way. I nodded in agreement and took off at a trot. Bill wanted to send men with me, and I refused for the same reason Adolph had. I knew what kind of animal this was, what kind we were tracking, and a big party would only get more men killed. I set off at a trot with Maggie at my side and prayed I would catch up with Adolph before long, though. I took my Motorola, and Bill gave me some extra batteries. Adolph had left deliberate sign, which was good because the man he tracked was good at not leaving much, if any. Still, there was some, but it would have slowed a man down trying to cut it. I was able to move quickly as a result, quicker than either of them, and knew I would catch up before nightfall. Maggie and I drank from the streams and springs as I tracked, weapon at the ready and always alert. She was not a tracker, but her sense of smell would alert me if anyone was circling back on my trail. I wept a little when I thought of Eddie, his gentle spirit. These were tough times, and people died in tough times, but still, not Eddie, a good man. I thought of the men I had lost in war, the women too, for girls were also doing their share of the fighting and dying. First we had lost Nicole, and then others. It was sad. 3 hours later we found what I had feared the most, the body of a brave and noble man, Sheriff Adolph Branson, who gave his life trying to protect others. The body was over an hour dead and was missing his rifle, his knife, and his watch. He had been stabbed multiple times with a knife. Apparently, he had tried to take the man captive, just as he had been trained to do. There was a place on the ground where I could see the man had been sitting, the man we were tracking. He might have even been taking a nap when the sheriff had snuck up on him. The blood, the evidence of a struggle, the scarring and displacement of the ground and leaves. Then I found it, a clear boot print. It had a crack on the left heel. I looked at it carefully and then sketched it out so I could publish it. I regretted not having a digital camera, for even though we were in lights out, we were definitely not without electricity and the ability to utilize a lot of our former technology, although when it did eventually wear out, it would no doubt be gone forever. I called the fire station, who sent out the ATV and picked us up. I was exhausted, and when I got to the station, Bill was there. He took charge of the remains of our friend. I went home that night feeling so helpless, so useless and small. I was angry that this man had gotten away, and also that he would no doubt strike again. Something about this man told me I had seen him before. The knife slashes, the cruelty. Jacqueline had a little supper waiting for me when I got home. She cooked it with tears in her eyes, tears for her dear friend Eddie. I ate that supper with tears of my own, tears for two good men who had died today at the hands of one who didn't deserve to live. As the sun rose shining through the window of the shop, Jim Hodges could not believe his good luck. He had been approached just weeks before the collapse by a man who was very official and brusque, yet not rude. He had invited him to lunch and said he had a business proposal. The man had explained that he worked for a certain clientele that needed Jim's services, that it would be a very unusual and high-paying job. As a master mechanic, he often got solicitations to work overseas, and some of that had paid very well, although at times it hardly seemed worth what he got. He listened because that morning he had been fired from his job rather abruptly, and for no good reason. He did not tell the man that sat across the table from him now, who seemed so at ease, so in control. Jim figured him for a cop and thought this might be a background investigation for one of his friends, taking a security job, but he wasn't. The man introduced himself only as Jason and said his clients had taken the liberty of doing a preliminary background investigation on him before making him this lucrative offer. The word lucrative caught Jim's attention. He wondered why the man was approaching him. There were plenty of mechanics with his credentials. But what Jason didn't say was that he also fit a profile that the Eagle's Lair was looking for in support of security, namely, no family ties. Although they offered to allow the support people to bring their immediate family, they knew the men and women had none, and their lifestyles were the kind that made them terminally single. The offer was simple. He would be paid a sum of $20,000 in advance upon successful execution of the legal instrument which Jason had a copy of for him to review. Jason read a little and saw it was somewhat vague but very precise. He would have to agree to a non-binding non-disclosure agreement and also agree to security measures, investigations, searches, and the right of the employer to terminate him at any point. Jason directed his attention to the third page, where a very unusual condition was listed out. Once he took the job, he would not be able to leave for a period of up to 1 year. The contract seemed to be very specific on this one, and it was even printed in bold letters. "Can I know where this is?" Jim had asked, sipping on his coffee. The man started to answer and then hesitated for a moment as he could hear the waitress coming their way, who said, "Coffee, honey?" She smiled at Jason as she said this. Jim noted that she didn't even look his way. He wasn't much to look at, and certainly not dressed as nice as Jason. "No, thank you, miss," Jason smiled and paused as he waited for her to be out of earshot before answering. "No, sir, I am afraid we cannot disclose this, but that is why your employment will include a generous pay and allowance package, as well as a severance option after 1 year." He continued, "Your quarters are very nice. Here are some photographs." Jason showed him several pictures in a brochure, and Jim noted that the camera angles were tightly framed. It could have been anywhere in the world, and he guessed this was quite deliberate. "I want to be paid every month," Jim stated, and Jason had answered, "Of course." Jim had worked overseas enough to know to get paid monthly, have it paid into an offshore account, but with the economic chaos of the world, the theft by bankers, the gambling on Wall Street, Jim didn't want paper money, he wanted gold. "And I want to be paid in gold," he stated, not looking at Jason as he sipped his coffee. "Of course," Jason smiled, handing his pen over, and with that, Jim had signed. That had been only a few months ago. Now he was living inside of a place called the Eagle's Lair, and thought that even eagles didn't know where this place was. He wasn't complaining, though. Life was good. The compound had a very tight perimeter around the edge, and just outside were several acres of land being plowed with some very quiet tractors. Everything had a silenced muffler on it here, and Jim knew why. They didn't want noise to travel. He stood right next to one of the 50-horsepower John Deere tractors. The compound had 4 men who were experts at farming and gardening, 2 doctors, nurses, a small hospital, a restaurant, a gym, and more. It was a small and beautiful little town surrounded by even more beautiful houses, like a very wealthy subdivision. Everything was done to the highest standards and required a small army of people to keep running. They, the support people, lived in the other side of town, as Jim called it, the other side of the tracks, with the other servants. Everyone moved around in electric cars, and the compound had massive rows upon rows of solar panels with battery banks and very quiet diesel generators to help keep the batteries topped off. It was a model city, and a very dysfunctional one, too. The servants were told on day 1 that they were not to address any of the clients, the word used to refer to the wealthy who lived in the Emerald City part of the compound. They were only to speak when spoken to, and to not make eye contact, and to be extremely polite. They had been given a full day's briefing, which had also included the restrictions regarding the perimeter, as well as these instructions. Nobody was permitted to enter the wire-enclosed zone that extended outward nearly 1,000 yards past the compound in any direction. This was used predominantly for growing crops and grazing cattle, sheep, and chickens. There were 3 helicopters, too. Those had been used to fly him and the others in. Jim found out that some of the security had been here for quite some time and were flown in and out after they had been with the Eagle's Lair for at least a year. One man named Tim had told him this and said that when they were let out, they were followed and knew that if they mentioned anything, even in passing, they would be terminated immediately. When Tim had said the word terminated, Jim thought it odd the way he emphasized it and wondered if he meant terminated to be shot. Probably so, he thought. There was way too much invested here in this place. Everything had been considered, Jim realized, and everybody seemed pretty much happy. The rich had their little world with all the comforts and the help. Well, the help had it good too, especially when they heard of what was happening in the outside world. The compound management had let them know, perhaps so they would not panic, or perhaps to underline just how good they really had it, and Jim had to agree, they really did. He also got paid very well. He knew now that his money would be useless, and the compound had anticipated this for them all. Although there wasn't anything to buy here, no new cars or automobiles or motorcycles, they were paid, all of them, in gold, at the rate of exchange gold was trading for on the day of the collapse. Jim was therefore paid 10 ounces of gold a month in 1-ounce coins. Everyone was paid the same, although not at the same rate, obviously. Jim already had 30 ounces and wondered what he would do with that when he got out. Would things ever stabilize? There were even pretty girls working here, an even match-up of men to women, and Jim thought surely even he could get a date. He tightened the muffler onto the tractor and fired up the engine, then ran it up to near maximum RPM. He went to the other side of the shop to get his torque wrench to make sure the muffler did not rattle off. What he did not see and could not know was that the casting on the manifold where the oversized muffler attached was not designed for this extra weight. Suddenly it cracked and the muffler fell away, crashing to the shop floor. The roar of the tractor was deafening at near full RPMs, and immediately security began running his way. Apparently they had a drill for this event too, just like they did for everything else. Jim rushed to the tractor to shut it down, but one of the security studs beat him to it and cut him an angry look as he shut it down. Jim shrugged his shoulders as if to say he was sorry and wondered if he was going to be terminated. After a few hours, though, the incident was forgotten. The tractor could be fixed, and he made a note to upgrade all of the other muffler mounts when he got some time. Chopper 1. Kevin volunteered to stay at the farmhouse while we buried Eddie because he had been asked to. He felt so bad for them all. Eddie was obviously important to them. Small towns tended to be like that, he guessed, and that was a good thing and probably a bad one. No secrets here, that's for sure. He got out the splitting axe and sharpened it before stepping outside to the woodshed. He was getting really good at splitting, and Al had showed him the tire trick, which made things go a lot faster. He worked steadily for nearly an hour before stopping to get a drink. He walked down the hill to the pitcher pump by the road. It was the coolest water around, and he liked sitting on the bench there to take a little break as well. As he approached, he couldn't see the pump, but could hear it creaking and groaning. Somebody was there, so he slowed down a bit. He didn't want whoever was there to feel rushed. As of late, a lot of people were filling up their buckets from this pump. The snow was almost all melted, except for a few stubborn holdout patches deep in the woods where the sun probably never shone. Suddenly, though, the newly budding leaves of the tree, through them, he saw who it was, and his heart skipped a beat. Linda. He wasn't ready. He smelled bad, hadn't even brushed his teeth. He thought of turning and walking away. Liz had told him just last night, gently and kindly, that Linda needed some time, that she had lost her husband recently, and that he should just wait a bit. Kevin knew he had looked confused. He understood, but didn't know what to do next. Was he wrong to even have these feelings for her? Was it that obvious? Liz saw his look and said, "Don't worry, dear, I'll help you." She mussed his hair like his mom used to do, and he felt embarrassed, especially when she kissed him on top of the head and took his face in both of her hands and said, "Kevin, you're a handsome young man. You're sweet, and any woman would be lucky to have you." Kevin blushed and stammered as she stepped back and put a hand on her hip and said playfully, "If I didn't already have my Steve, I might just keep you all to myself." Kevin knew she was probably just being nice, but he appreciated that. Just give her time, sweetie. She needs to grieve, accept the loss, accept all that has happened, and then her heart will be ready. Pausing, she had leaned down and looked into his face. "It won't be forever either. Trust me, I know these things." Now, though, he was going to blow it. Linda was here at the well, and she had seen him already, and now he couldn't just turn around and go back. He wished he had an undo button, or better yet, could just disappear. Linda looked up for just a second and then said politely, "Good morning, Kevin." She said his name, and he liked the way it sounded when she said it. Almost done. He thought of something clever to say, and all that he thought of was, "Oh, no hurry, take your time." Linda? He had heard once that you should say a woman's name to her when you speak to her. It made things more personal. She stopped for a minute without looking up, blew her hair out of her face, shook her head and smiled, but said nothing. Complete idiot, he thought. Why didn't you just say yes or okay or something like that? You want me to do that for you? He offered. Without stopping, she said, no thanks, I got it, and continued. Was she going faster? She was, he thought. She was in a hurry. Now he had totally blown it. She looked like something was bothering her, and he felt trapped, wanting to run away before he made things worse, not wanting to run because of how strange that would look, and wishing above all that he hadn't come down to get a drink. Next time, he'd look first. Finished, she put lids on the 2 5-gallon buckets and put them into the carrying yoke, squatted down and stood up. The 2 buckets together weighed 80 pounds full of water like that. Kevin noticed that she had filled them all the way to the top. They would slosh around a lot less that way, make them easier to carry. He thought of offering her a hand, but then remembered she said no. But maybe she only said no to helping pump the water and not to carrying it. Good God, what a fool I am, he thought, and just stood there stupidly as she walked away. Linda turned and over her shoulder said, see you later, Kevin. Kevin wanted to say something profound, something that told her that he was so much more than a stammering young man, something that said he may not have clever words but had a good heart and could love her and care for her and make her happy. But he had no words, and besides, it wasn't the time. Instead, all that came out was, okay, see you, Linda. Really? Is that the best you have? Nothing clever, smart, or even nice? He felt so small and inconsequential already. His awkwardness with women didn't help things either. Chopping wood later, he thought of every word, every look. He replayed the scene 1,000 times in his mind, and it all spelled one thing. She must think he was the biggest idiot in the world. He felt like he was blowing it with her. He would avoid her as much as possible from now on, even though he wanted just the opposite. Trudging back up the hill to the house, Linda had to smile. Kevin was a nice guy, actually a very nice-looking man with strong, clear eyes and a sincerity that emanated from his face. He was so socially awkward, though. She guessed he had almost no experience with women. While she would always love her Mark, would always grieve over his loss and the horror she had lived through on that day, she knew one day the page would turn. She had no desire to be with anyone right now, but knew that too would change one day as well. She would try to be a little more encouraging next time, she decided, seeing as Kevin was as socially graceful as an elephant at a tea party. Predators. The wind whistling against the screen window woke me up, but I was having a fitful sleep. Maggie nuzzled me. She had been trained to do this if she saw me having nightmares. Sitting up in the bed, she put her head on my leg and one paw as she had been taught to help me get my bearings. My mind and heart were troubled. I immediately thought of the loss we all felt for both Eddie and Adolph, but more. I thought of the predator that was out there. It would be only a matter of time before he struck again, before he took another innocent life. Quietly, I put on my clothes, picked up my rifle and chest rig. Then Maggie and I slipped out the back door. We walked up the steep hill behind the house, listening to the wind blowing through the fir trees, singing a timeless song of loneliness. The moon was bright still, but we both knew the way. The woods were quiet, dark, and beautiful. I came to the place where I often spoke to God. I took off my shoes in reverence and anticipation of His presence, knelt and prayed, asking God for guidance. I knew that it was God who was stirring my heart this way about this dangerous threat to His people. God reminded me of my calling in life, that He had called me to be a soldier, that He had trained my hands to war all my life. For those years before the collapse, He had also required me to be a watchman, warning of His coming chastisement, for that is what this collapse was. It was not His final judgment. It was His way of giving us all one more chance to turn toward Him. He had also required me, to those who heeded the warning, to train them to survive, to be a remnant, to protect and to hide themselves away. Now, God was His will was becoming more and more clear as he reminded me over and over of the things in my life which had prepared me for just this moment. I knew that Eddie's murder in particular had angered God, more so than any of the others. Eddie was slow, but he was also one of God's children, and the murderer that took the life of this gentle and kind man was now a stench in the nostrils of God. While it is true that God is love and mercy, he is also just, and he is angry with the wicked all day long. The blood of the innocent cries out to him. He had not just murdered an innocent, you see. This man had murdered one that had apparently fed him and shown him kindness, treacherous and deceitful. God has a special hatred for anyone who oppresses the poor because they show contempt for their Maker. Whether it be those Wall Street tycoons who had robbed people blind and crashed the economy, or a murderer who kills a poor man to steal his food and belongings, God holds them all in contempt. I could feel God's anger now toward this man and knew as a warrior what I had to do. I prayed further and was reminded of the scriptures about revenge belonging to God, how he would repay. I therefore asked God this simple thing: Lord, stay my hand from revenge, for that is yours alone, but strengthen it to do justice, to do thy justice and thy will. Please give me wisdom to know what to do, and the courage to do it without hesitation. After a moment, I felt the presence of God depart and knew he was done speaking. Maggie and I headed to the house swiftly. It was time to go to war. Ghillie. Dirty and the Snake put on the special camouflage suits that Big Mike had provided them after showing them how to wear and modify them. These were ghillie suits, he had explained. They were used by snipers for whom remaining undetected was more than a good idea. It was an absolute necessity for them to survive. A sniper has to maneuver into position, make a single accurate shot, and then remain undetected as the enemy scan angrily and vigorously to try and find who fired that shot. Dirty laughed when he thought of how stupid so-called snipers were in the movies, leaning out of windows, firing multiple times, no camouflage, climbing up in trees, and worse. He and the Snake would be doing a pure recon mission for the next several days. They had their CETME rifles and pistols, but were also armed with some very high-end optical gear, including a Bushnell Endeavor spotting scope, a digital camera with a very robust telephoto lens that could shoot video at 18 megapixel quality, as well as 7x50 binos and backup camera. There were several flash cards and dozens of extra batteries and a charger in the truck, which was hidden under a pile of brush. The truck was nearly invisible, in fact. Big Mike had stressed the need for accurate intelligence and knew that photographs and digital ones were superior to sketches and field reports. Dirty and the Snake had done recons before in the military and also against rival clubs and gangs. The latter had been easy by comparison to this one, though. They had never done one on so hard a target, never so valuable a target. The ghillie suits made the men look like some kind of Sasquatch furry beasts. They now busied themselves applying bits of local foliage into the suits, which already were very close to the area they were in. They checked each other out and then applied camouflage face paint, did a noise check by jumping up and down, checked their commo gear to make sure they could speak to each other. Their long-range radios were left in the truck, and they were a good 5 miles away from the compound, they estimated. They had found the compound after 3 days of foot patrols, or at least its general location, of stopping and listening. Danny's article from the former disgruntled employee had stated that there were no roads in, and that the equipment and building materials were all flown in by helicopter. A massive and costly undertaking, but it made sense. Danny said that they probably had less than 4 pilots and co-pilots who would then be in the know and who were offered the same deal, a place on board the Eagle's Lair, Noah's Ark, so to speak, would guarantee them their silence. There were probably servants and staff too. Most of them probably got invited in or brought in at the last moment. The secrecy they must have had to go through for this place to keep it hidden had to have been enormous. No roads in was also a beautiful idea, and now Dirty and the Snake were paying for that. The terrain was anything but a happy walk in the woods as they fought and clawed their way through dense forests that had probably never seen a human being in decades. They were nearing the outer perimeter, they figured, and the signs they saw told them both that they were heading in the right directions. The signs were not very well thought out. They were not just your normal posted signs. They read, "Warning, private property, no trespassing." These signs were normal for property that people lived on, but not in Maine on rural and undeveloped land. Here they were quite out of place. Having them so far back in the woods was even more suspicious. It was the sound of a generator, though, one morning that had alerted them, that had keyed them. It had only run for a few seconds and then was gone, but the Snake had quickly shot an azimuth to it, and they had consulted their maps. Danny had included an aerial photograph from Google and had pointed out how the area looked odd, like somebody had cut and pasted more forest in. In fact, they had. Blowing the photograph up several times, Danny had noted the irregularities in the cut and paste job done with video editing. Bingo. Now they were moving to that area, and it was tough going. There was no trail, and that would make the approach in hard for them, and harder still if the fallen were going to bring up their vehicles in support. This was like a castle moat that was miles in any direction. After several hours of tough going, the two men were exhausted and stripped off the ghillie suits and wore only their real tree camouflage, but did reapply face paint just in case. They didn't want to shred the ghillies in this thick brush and rocky terrain. They continued to move and listen periodically, but heard nothing. They knew it was like shooting a bow and arrow blindfolded, but figured if they got within a mile they would hear something. No way you could keep something this big both invisible and quiet. They bedded down that night and noticed something odd. Just as it got truly dark, about an hour past sunset, there was a faint glow in the distance. Not an actual light they could see, rather just a sort of general glow. Gotcha. The Snake got out his compass and checked. The azimuth matched the one they had shot earlier very closely. Snake remembered his training from survival school, how cities and towns had ambient light that bounced off the clouds and haze above and created just this sort of glow. He had checked it out when they were in the field at Fort Lewis, could detect the base and also the town of Olympia that way at a distance. They had found their target. Tomorrow would be the hardest part of their mission, their recon, and both men knew this place would be guarded as tight as Fort Knox. This has been Chapter 16 of the E-Novel survival novel, The Walls Came Tumbling Down, as read by the author. Tune in next Friday for Chapter 17.